Delegates in C# are really powerful, but most people don't know how to use them effectively, if at all. Today, I'm going to show you what delegates are, how to use them, why they're useful, and really how to take your code to the next level. Along the way, I'll cover the special types of delegates named Func and Action. Now, if all these new words seem intimidating, don't worry. This topic is actually really simple at its foundation. Yes, you can do some complex things with delegates, but an actual delegate is absolutely simple. Now, if you're new to this channel, my name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to make learning C# easier. This channel is full of videos explaining the various parts of C#. There's even a full course on building an application from scratch. I hope you find these videos useful, and if you do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the little bell icon to get notified when I release a new video every Monday. Also, check out the link to my mailing list in the description below. That will keep you informed of all the new training resources I'm creating. For those of you who have found this content valuable and are financially able, I'd appreciate it if you check out my Patreon page. If you become a supporter, you can get exclusive behind-the-scenes access. Also, everyone who's a supporter at any level will get access to the goal rewards when we hit them. Those rewards include a tour of my office, a documentary on how I make videos, and even a full course. The link to Patreon is in the description below. All right, so let's look at the demo application I've set up. And if you want this application at this current state, you can go to the link in the description for my blog, where you'll see the download link for the starter code for this application. You'll also see the code for the finishing code of this application. So you can see where we started from and where we got to. So what I have here is a solution with 3 projects. The console UI, which is a console application. The demo library, which is a class library, the full .NET Framework class library. And then a WinForms UI. To start with, we're just going to concentrate on the console UI and demo library. The WinForms UI is for once we have a good handle on how delegates work, we're going to bring that WinForms UI in to really show off the power of using delegates. So let's look at what we have in the program.cs, which is open. So we have this static shopping cart model called cart, and we also have this method called populate cart with demo data, which I called right away. What that does, it just puts 4 items in the cart. As you can see, 4 shopping cart items, cereal, milk, strawberries, and blueberries, and then rough prices. All right, and the M indicates that this is a decimal field. So you have to use an M to signify that the actual numbers here are decimal and not double. Because by default, they revert to double because it's much less space that it takes up, and that's what we use for most numbers that need a decimal point. But for money, we really should use decimal because that's much more precise. It's precise to the about 28th place or so after the decimal, versus double is only precise to, I think, the 15th place, which is still very precise. It's just not nearly as precise as what you'd need for your bank account. Okay, so the other thing this does is we have here this console write line that says the total for the cart is, and then it calls the cart, which is that shopping cart model, .generate total. And this :C2 just indicates that I want this to be a money, which since I'm in the US, it's going to be a $sign, and it's going to have 2 places after the decimal. That's the 2. And so it'll show it formatted as money. So if we just run this before we look at the class library, let's just run this real quick, and you'll see that it says the total for the cart is $20.64. Now, if you're doing quick calculations in your head, and you look at 3.5 and 3, that's 6.5. That's 13, 14. That's 22, almost 23. That doesn't add up to 20.64. So what's the difference? Well, I'll show you. So this generate total is in the shopping cart model. Now the shopping cart model is really simple. It has 2 things. It has the list of product model called items, and that's the items in the cart. And a product model is really simple. It's just the item name and price. But the generate total is a little different. So the subtotal is items.sum, So it takes the list of items, it does a sum on the price. So it adds all the prices together and gets what's called a subtotal. That's essentially just all those things added together. But wait, there's more. We want to give a discount to our users who buy a certain amount of product from us. So if the subtotal is greater than $100, we're going to multiply that subtotal times 0.8, which means essentially we're giving them 20% off their order. If their order is greater than $50, this is an else if, that's why it doesn't run again, then it multiplies it by 0.85, which means a 15% discount. And if a subtotal is greater than 10, then we multiply it by 0.9, which is a 10% discount. But if you're not buying at least $10 worth of product, then it's the raw cost. It's just the subtotal. All right, so we can actually put a breakpoint here. Let's do that. So we can see, let's actually put it right after the sum. So we can see how this works. I mean, it's pretty simple, but I want to make sure you understand the foundation of this before we move on. So the subtotal for our cart, if we mouse over this, is a little small, but it says $22.93. So that's the full price, $22.93. Now, if we step into our code using F11 or the step into button right here, where my mouse is, it will step over the first if because it's not greater than 100, over the next if, and into the third one. So it says, okay, subtotal times 0.9, and returns right away, which means now it will write out to the console. And I'm not putting that into a variable first, which is, it's kind of a shorthand there, which doesn't allow me to debug as easily, but it is less lines of code. So that's up to you if you want to do this shorthand where you put the method call right here, or if you want to put this method call into a variable, then put the variable in this spot. That's a little less efficient, but we're talking minuscule scale. But it is a little less efficient, but it does give you a better picture of how to debug this application a little more simply. There is a way of looking at this return using the debugging tools, but it's a little simpler if it's just put into a variable and you can read the variable right in the debugger. Okay, so to continue, that's what we get at the end. Total cart will be $20.64. All right, so that's how this application works. So now that we have a picture of how our application works, let's talk about delegates and how we can make our lives a little easier. So a delegate, let's just explain this first and I'll show you how to use it so you can kind of see it as well. A delegate as foundation, all it is you pass in a method instead of a property or instead of a variable. All right, so when you're passing in information to a method, if we had a input here called, int I, we'd pass in, a number or, another variable. Well, a delegate is the same kind of thing, only you're passing a method in. And that may seem a little weird, a little strange, but it has some really powerful uses. So let's see this in action. So here, we are calculating the subtotal, but we're never showing it to the user. Well, that might be something we want to know. What was the original total, and then what discount did we give them? Well, we could return a tuple here, which is essentially two different return values instead of just one. So you have return being the total and another return being the subtotal. Or we could do an out variable, but both of those seem a little hacky, especially since all we want to do is alert the user. All right, so you just want to tell them, hey, you know what? Here's a subtotal. Think of this as, there's certain cases where you want to just tell the user something. Maybe you had, an error or an issue in your application, and you want to pop up a message box or an alert or something like that. This is one of those kind of cases where you have some kind of alert you want to give the user. It's not a great idea to have your return type hold all the possible different alerts that you could have. So how do you do this? Well, the way you could do it is to create a delegate. All right. So in this class, we're going to create one and then make it the parameter for our method. So in our class, at the very top, we're going to say public delegate void. It's not going to return anything. And let's say we'll call this the mention discount. So we're going to mention what the discount is in some way. And we're going to pass in the decimal subtotal. All right. So what this does is it says this is the definition for a delegate. Think of this almost like an interface. Now, if you haven't watched my video on interfaces, you might want to brush up on that, not because that's exactly what this is, but it gives you a good frame of reference. Plus, interfaces are good to learn. But this is a contract that says whenever you use this, what's going to work kind of like a parameter, whenever you use this, it's going to return void, the method is, and it's going to take in one decimal. The actual name doesn't really matter, but that's what it's going to do. So mention discount. So in our generate total, we're going to say mention discount, and we'll give this a name. I'm going to call it just all lowercase m mention discount. All right, so what it's going to do is it's going to pass in whatever method we pass in is going to come into this variable. All right, so now what we can do is after we generate the subtotal, we can say mention discount and pass in a subtotal, which we have right here. Now, what does that do? Well, it calls the method mention discount, which is whatever we passed in here, and it passes in that decimal. Besides that, this class has no idea what that does, and that's a good thing. All right, so we're getting some loosely coupled applications here. And by that, I mean, since this generate total method has no clue what this method does or where it's located or anything like that. So I'll show you next how to create a method to pass in here and then how this works. So let's go over to the program.cs again. Now in here, what I'm going to do, now notice we have the error here because we need a parameter we don't have yet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new method. I'm going to make it a private static void. I'll call it subtotal alert. And I'll pass in a decimal that's a subtotal. Now, you're probably realizing this is the method I'm going to pass in here. But notice it's called subtotal alert versus this one is called mention discount, or the lowercase equivalent. Well, that's because these two are not really related in any way. The only thing that matters is that it returns void and it takes in a decimal. Those are the only real two things that matter. As long as it fits that structure, it can be used. So I'll take the subtotal alert and I will paste it in here. Now notice I did not put my parens, no open and close paren for this method. That's because you don't do that with delegates. You just pass in the name of the method you're going to call, because we don't have what the decimal subtotal is going to be. So we couldn't put the parens here because we'd have to put in the input. We don't have that. So we just pass in the name of the method. All right. Now finally, inside this method, I'm going to do a console write line. And I will say $, open and close my double quotes. Inside here, I will say the subtotal is, and I'll do my curly braces and say subtotal colon C2, close curly brace. Just so you know, I mentioned before that this applies the money and makes it 2 decimal places long. But normally, I put spaces before and after inside these curly braces. Some people like that, some people don't. But you can't after the C2 because it tries to read that as part of the format. So you have to make sure there's no white space after the C2 before the closed curly brace, which makes it look really weird if you have a space before. So I just take it out on both sides. All right, so I know I've kind of rushed through this a little bit, and if you're a little bit lost, don't worry, it'll click. But essentially what I want to do is I want to get this in front of you so you can see it working, see how it works, and then hopefully that will, kind of spark that, oh yeah, moment for you. So just to kind of recap before you run this, generate total now takes in a method, which is called a delegate. All right, but it's called, that delegate was called mention discount. That's the name we give it, the parameter name we give it. And we can call that method passing in the decimal subtotal. Over here, we declared the method in our program.cs, the console application. And we, again, take in that decimal subtotal and are going to do a console.writeLine and say the subtotal is, and there you go. So even though the demo library doesn't know anything about console UI, doesn't know a thing about the console, it can still call a method inside the console because we passed it through our method. Now, just to be clear here, if you're at all familiar with asynchronous programming and threaded programming, this is not thread safe right now because I'm calling the UI thread in this delegate, which is fine unless you do asynchronous programming with this specific piece, in which case you'll have to do some checking to see if you need to invoke first. I'll cover that in a future async video. I have one more to do, I think. I'll be covering using delegates in an asynchronous way in that video. All right, so let's run this thing and see how it works. All right, there we go. It says the subtotal is $22.93. The total for the cart is $20.64. So it ran this method even though it was in the console application, not the library where it was actually executed from. All right, so that's how delegates work. Delegates are essentially just methods you pass around and can execute in other locations. And because it just matters about the signature, what it returns and what it passes in, we don't even have to have the coupling of knowing any kind of intermediate class structure or some kind of this is how it's going to look and work and anything where it's kind of tying things together. This is really loosely coupled. All you need to know is it's a method that returns void and passes in a decimal. That's it. So that's pretty simple stuff. We're just passing the method around. That's all we're doing. Now let's take it a little bit to the next level by looking at Func and Action, which are essentially just shortcuts for us. So Microsoft has created some shortcuts that use generics to make our lives a little easier in most cases. So let's go back to the shopping cart model. Now, if you look at this for any length of time, you've probably noticed that there's something not really good here. And that is this method right here, generate total. And the reason it's not really good is because we have a whole bunch of hard-coded items. And that's not really wise. Because what's going to happen is you're going to put this application into production. And the day after, almost invariably seems like the day after. Hopefully it's the day before, but usually it's not. Usually it waits until after. The day after it goes into production, your boss is going to come to you and say, you know what? We're running a different kind of sale. And now if it is over $20, they get 90% off or 10% off. And if it's over $10, they get 5% off. And so what you have to do is come back into this code and you have to modify it again, put another else statement in here or else if, and say, change this one, make it 95, and then make this 20, and then put another one in here that's 10 and 95. And it's just a complicated thing that you have to do. You have to actually modify code. and recompile everything and redeploy it, retest everything, and then push it to production. That's not the wisest way of doing things, especially if, as it should be, this is in a library, because this library may be used by 10, 12, 15 different applications in your company. Well, if you have to recompile this library with new code, that means that you have to change all your applications by recompiling them and redeploying them. And that's really not efficient. Now, we could pass in these as variables. So, greater than what, and what's the percentage. But what if you have 1 versus 4 or 5 different levels? Well, then you have some kind of dictionary where you have the different levels, and you have to have some kind of loop that goes through it. But then what if you decide, I'm going to change things entirely and not do it based upon how many dollars are in your shopping cart, but how many items are in your shopping cart? Well, that wouldn't work. You have to rewrite the application. And that isn't a good plan. If we looked at our design patterns video on Solid, the open-close principle says that we shouldn't be making changes to this application or this class if we can help it. Now, you could argue this is the one reason to change, but we can actually change it so that there's almost zero reason to change, or close to it. There'll still be a reason to change, but be much less. And the way we're going to do that is through a delegate. All right, so this calculating the subtotal, that's fine. We're just doing a calculation here. Now notice, I want to point this out real quick. I'm going to come back to how you do this, but this sum right here, if we mouse over it, it's actually taking in a func of product model, comma, decimal. What that is a delegate. So this right here is actually using a delegate called func. It's one of our special types of delegates. We're going to come back to how we do this, but I just want to point that out. We're actually already using a delegate right here. All right, so the code you want to work with is this code right here. This code is subject to change quite often. So how do we take this out and use a delegate instead? Well, we could declare another delegate and then pass it in here. But this time, we're going to use the Func Delegate type. So I'm going to put comma. I'm actually going to go on a new line here because it's getting rather long here. So we say func, F-U-N-C. Now notice it's a generic, and it says it has an out T result. So by default, it actually has 16 overloads. So the first, iteration of this would be just to return something, not to actually have anything passed in. But that's no fun. So we can actually pass in, notice in T1, in T2, out T result, and all the way through, there's a lot of them. Now after 15, oh, it has only 16. I don't know what you do after you get 16. I thought it was limitless, but it might not be. You might be only able to pass in 16 different variables. If that's the case, you're back to creating a delegate. It's just one of those limitations for this simplicity model. So the func, we're going to pass in first a list of product model. All right, that's going to be our shopping cart items. And the reason I do that is because I want to actually have the whole list there in case I want to do something besides just work with the subtotal. Subtotal is great, and we'll pass that in as well, because we've already calculated it. But just in case I want to use that, count of how many products are in the cart, or give a discount of a certain products in the cart, or any of those kind of things, I want to pass in that list of product model. Now, again, I don't put the parens here. I just pass in the type. So list of product model. Next, I'm going to pass in that subtotal. You type decimal. And finally, I'm going to output type decimal. And that'll be the total. Now notice how I don't want to say confusing, but it's a little confusing how it's laid out because I'm not naming these things. I'm just passing in the types. And that is one of those limitations. Now, I don't know a way to rename this, and I like that. I think that's one of the things I'll mention to Microsoft at some point. But for now, it's just the 3 types. So a list of product model, decimal, and decimal. So just know this is the items, this is the subtotal, and this is the total that gets returned back. So Func takes in up to 16 parameters as inputs, and the last parameter it has in the list is always the output. So Func is a method that has a return value other than void. All right, we need to give this a name since this is the type. So the type, the whole thing is the type now for our parameter. It's Func list of product model, comma decimal, comma decimal. That's the type. And we're gonna call this calculate discounted total. Be very clear in what the name is so that it's easier to use. All right. Now, before I actually use this, I'm going to cut this out so that I have it for later. I'll just paste it in over in my program.cs. So down here, I'm going to say return calculate discounted total. I'm going to pass in arg1 and arg2, which are my list of items, which is called items. So items. And then the second argument is my subtotal. Now notice I'm returning that because this returns a decimal. Therefore, that's my total. That's what gets returned back. Over in program.cs, I need another method over here. Let's call this private static void. And we'll call this calculate leveled discount because this is the type of discount we're calculating. And I need to pass in a list of product model. We'll call it product, or let's call it items. And a decimal, that's the subtotal. So now, oops, it's not a void, it's decimal. All right, so there you go. So now you have a match to our Func parameter. It returns a decimal. It takes in 2 things, the list of product model and the decimal. Now we're not using the list of product model, but I wanted that flexibility because actually later we're going to use that list for something else. It's kind of better to plan these things out and give yourself the most wiggle room just in case. All right. So in this case, I was pretty sure this list might come in handy. Therefore, I'm going to pass it in. So I pass in this list of items. I pass in the subtotal. I'm using that subtotal like I was in the shopping cart model, but now I'm doing the calculation here. So this method can now be passed into the generate total. I say calculate level discount. Again, no parens. So no open close paren with the different variables. It's just the name of the method. Calculate level discount. So this is the method I'm passing in. All right. So if we run this, notice that nothing has changed. The subtotal is $22.93, and the total for the cart is $20.64. Let's make some tweaks here. Let's make this, let's say it's only a 5% discount if you have $10 in the cart. Let's just make sure that it indeed does change. And there you go, $21.78. So that's different. So that just goes to show we are running this method now instead of having it be inside the generate total method in here. All right. So now this generate total gets the subtotal. It mentions that in some kind of alerting system. And then it returns the calculation that we passed in. Now the difference between the delegate we did for the mentioned discount and the func we did for the calculate discounted total is that for the delegate, we actually had to declare it up here. And that's kind of like our interface that said, okay, here's how it's going to look. Here's a signature, so that then we could use that signature in other places to make sure that it truly did match up. With this func, we don't have to create that signature. What it does mean is that every time we use this, we have to declare this whole line instead of just this mention discount, which doesn't have the return type or the input type, and so it's a little bit shorter. So it's up to you which one you use, depending on the circumstances and depending on how complicated your application is. The other thing that Func doesn't do is it doesn't work with out parameters, meaning this decimal cannot be an out. So if you're going to do that, you actually have to use a delegate and declare it there. So that's another reason why you can't always use Func. Now, you may wonder at this point, before you go on, you may be saying, well, why do I even have this generate total method here? Because it seems like most of the work is being done here, so why not just put all the work here and not even have the method over here? And that's a valid question. And there's a number of reasons I can give. But I think the most common one, the one that's mostly going to apply here, is the fact that typically this method right here will do more than these three things. For example, it might first loop through the entire list and check to make sure they're all in stock. Because maybe it was in stock when you put it in your cart, but maybe it's not in stock now that you go to checkout. And so you need to check that first. And we might also check for other things like you can't buy this if this is also in your cart. So maybe you can only buy one thing or the others. That kind of validation. All that goes in here. All right. It's only this unique to the caller type code where we calculate the discount where you'd want to put that in program.cs. Another example might be if you're creating an employee account. So maybe this was the generate employee. And it's going to go through and it's going to put their information into the HR system, and it's going to, give them special access to the different areas they have and all the rest. But maybe there's some special things you do for only certain employees. Or, certain employees get a different setup, a little bit, a tweak. That's when you use a delegate to pass in those tweaks for just certain cases. So while this is really simple, the reality is you wouldn't do most, if not all, your work in a delegate. Usually you're doing tweaks or modifications and doing a little bit of code compared to the overall of the method in the delegate. And for the most part, you're doing, the rest of your code in this class, or, it's calling other classes, but it's not passing all that to the UI I do. The UI shouldn't do most of the work. And in fact, I wouldn't say the UI is necessarily the layer that would use most of the delegates. I might have a layer, this demo library might be my base company library. That's kind of like the foundation of everything we do. But then I'd have another library that calls this library that passes the delegates in. So this is the normal shopping cart. This is the VIP customer shopping cart processor. And all the different levels where it passes in the different delegates depending on, what kind of person is checking out or what kind of circumstances you're running into. So just kind of mention that this is a demo. It's not a full-blown application. So I don't want you to get the wrong idea of how you use delegates. All right. So the last one I want to show you before we kind of start taking on a little more of the power of these delegates is the Action Delegate. Now I'm going to stretch things just a little bit because you wouldn't do this necessarily normally because it's kind of overload what we're doing with delegates. But I want to show off how Action works. So I'm going to create a new Action Delegate. Again, it's just like Func. It's just that Action returns a void. All right. So Action, we're going to call this mention discount, and we'll pass in a string. So again, we can pass in 0 or more of these. So we can do this. And if we just do Action, that'll work as well. And that's the 0. but I want to do action of type string, and we'll call this the mention discounting. Okay, and this is going to be an alert. And so I want to have some kind of alert to tell a user, hey, I'm applying the discount now. All right, so, and that's way too close to mention discount. Let me rename that. Tell user we are discounting. That's really long, but it's very descriptive of what it's doing, and it doesn't get us confused with mention discount. All right, and maybe I should say mention subtotal here. In fact, let's do that. I'll do control dot and rename it. All right, so now it's mentioned subtotal. That's a little clearer. And now tell user we are discounting. Okay. Think of this like we want to alert the user in some way. So we're going to say tell user we're discounting, and we're just going to pass in a string which says we are applying your discount. That's all we're going to do. Think like a log message or an alert of some kind. Okay, again, a little bit stretching what we do a delegate because we wouldn't have all three of these delegates in one method. But I want to show you three different kinds. Okay, so action, we pass in a string, it returns nothing. Let's go over to our program CS, and here we're going to add a new method. And let's call this method private static void alert user string message. This is even a little more generic. Is the wrong word because we use generic in a very specific way in C#, but it's a little more multi-use, I guess I could say, in its usage. So alert user, we're just going to say console write line the message. That's it. So that's all we're going to do is pass whatever message you pass through, we're going to write out to the console. So alert user, I'll come up here to our generate total, which is yelling at us now because we need a third item. That third item is our alert user. Tell user we're discounting. Okay. Now, if we run this, let me bring this over here. It says the subtotal is $22.93. We're applying your discount, and now the total for the cart is $21.78. So there's that middle one is our message or our alert. All right. So that's the three kinds of delegate: the actual raw kind of standard delegate, and then the two upgraded or wrapped delegates, which are Func and Action. The difference being that Func returns a value and Action does not, returns a void. So that's delegates in a nutshell, but we're not done yet. So I want to show off some of the power here, and then we'll move over to our WinForm UI. So the first thing I want to show off, let's go down here below the console write line, which tells us, calls that method and prints out all three of those messages. So below that, we're actually going to, again, call the generate total method. But this time, I want to show you how to do this all inline. Because remember I said over here that this was a delegate, the sum that passed in a delegate? Well, we're going to do kind of the same thing over here. I want to do it with ours so you can see how they line up. So we know the cart.generate total returns a decimal. So I'm actually going to say decimal total equals cart.generate total. Okay, so I can put it into a variable. Now it's going to get a little long, so I'm going to hide that for now. But instead of passing in my three methods here, instead I'm going to pass in new methods that I create on the fly. So the first one is a subtotal alert, and that's a void. We just pass in our decimal. I'm sorry, it takes in a decimal. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to open and close parens. So a new set. So there's actually two right now. I'm going to say subtotal. All right. That's the name of my variable I'm going to give it. And then outside of that first set of parens, let's take that off so you can see it. Outside the first set of parens, I'm going to say equals greater than sign. And that's essentially a double arrow or a thick arrow. All right. And then I'm going to say console write line. And inside here, I'll say $, the subtotal for cart 2. So we can identify it's a different cart than the first one. The subtotal for cart 2 is, and I'll put my curly brace, and I'll say subtotal, which is the variable we're passing in here. And then colon C2 and close my curly brace, close my double quotes. The last thing I need to do is take off my semicolon. Okay, so the reason I did this way is I'm actually creating inline a full method to pass in. It's an anonymous method. Think of this as shorthand. So since it's anonymous, we don't need to give it a name for our method because the delegate doesn't care. All the delegate cares about is output type and input types. In this case, it's an action. So it returns void and it passes in a decimal. So we don't need to say decimal because it already knows that. And so we just need to give a name for our parameter. So that's our parameter name. We wrap it in parens because that's the call for the method. So normally a method has open and close parens at the end. That's what we're doing here. It's just that we're not actually giving the method a name. Now we say this arrow here. And that's what it's doing is saying, okay, here's your method. And then this one line of code. And since this is one line, there's no semicolon at the end. Now we can do multi-line. I'm going to show you that in a minute. But if it's single line, you just write out whatever code you want and don't put a semicolon at the end because you can only have one line of code in this, the way we're doing it here. Okay, with just one line. So no semicolon, just write it out like this. So that's saying here's what we're passing into our method that's anonymous, and here's the actual method body. And that's, we're also including that paren. Okay, so that's the whole method body. So again, if you can kind of wrap your mind around the fact that we're just kind of shortcutting a whole lot of things all at once, that's all this anonymous method that's inline is doing. Now it's only the first parameter, the first delegate, which is subtotal alert. So let's do the other two. So that's why it's yelling at me here. It's also saying I need a semicolon at the end, which I'll put in. Now it's yelling at me over here because I don't have all three, which is cool. That's what we want. I'll put comma. I'll go to the next line so you have a little more space. Let's click off there so we can actually not have that IntelliSense pop up. And it says calculate leveled discount. That's our func, which returns a decimal and it passes in those two items. So now what we need to do is we need to call that func. So we'll pass in the two parameters it needs. So the first parameter is our products. We can call it items, but I'm going to call it something a little different. Products. And then the second one is our subtotal. And then we'll do again that fat arrow, the equals greater than. And here I'm going to put my open and close curly braces. This is what we're going to do if you want more than one line of code. So this is where we're going to, normally we'd run this code right here. But in this case, I want to do something different than calculate based upon this formula. So instead, let's create a different formula. How about if products dot count is greater than 3, then we're going to return subtotal times 0.5m, which would be a 50% discount off your cart, else return just subtotal. So you don't get half off unless you have more than 3 items. Why you'd use it, I'm not sure. But at least that generates for us a different calculation than we have in the one down here. All right. And that kind of, again, illustrates we can pass in different things here and it still works just fine. So that's the second one. And the third one is the alert user. So after the curly brace, we comma. And I'll put on a new line here. Again, we're going to pass in just the string, so the message. And I'm going to say equals greater than. I'll just do an inline again because it's so simple. $. We're going to say alert or cart to alert colon message like so. And again, take off that semicolon that the CW tab added for us. That's that snippet. So now I've created 3 anonymous methods. And I've done it inline, which is, it's a little messy. And if you're passing in 3 delegates, it probably is a little messy. But typically, you'll only be doing 1 delegate. For example, in our shopping cart model, this is 1 delegate, okay? So X is our product model, and we are passing in and saying, okay, take the price for each of them. All right, and it's an extension method, so it's a little more complicated, but essentially it's taking the list and it's saying for each one, grab just the price, and then it's adding all those prices together, and that's the sum. So the delegate is saying, this is our parameter name we're giving it, X, and then here's the 1 line of code, which is just x.price. We don't need to say return here because that kind of handles it for us, but that's how the delegate is structured, is we just return the value that is the item, the property we want to actually sum together. Okay, so in our case, here's our 3 different delegates. We have the first one, which is our subtotal alert. We have the second one, which is a little more complicated, but it's our calculate level discount. And the third one is just our actual alert the users. Let's see how this works. So if we run this, we bring it over here. We see the subtotal is $22.93. We're applying your discount. The total for cart is $21.78. The subtotal for cart 2 is $22.93. And cart to alert is we're applying your discount. The only thing we're missing is the total for our cart 2. That's because we never actually printed it out. So let's go ahead and do that before I forget about it. I also put a blank console write line before we do the second cart just to kind of separate it. We'll do the same after. So dollars, whoops, IntelliSense jumping on me. $, double quotes. The total for cart 2 is, and it's the total colon C2. And close our double quotes, and we're good to go. And I'll again put that blank right line at the end. So now if we run this, it should have separated out into 2 sections. Same way it's working. $22.93 is the subtotal for both. We're applying the discount, and cart 2 is applying the discount. And then the total for the first cart is $21.78. The total for cart 2 is $11.47 because we had 4 items. Now just, again, to kind of play with this, let's go ahead and take away 1 item and run this. And now notice that the subtotal is the same for both, but the total for cart 2 is $14.09 as well because we only had 3 items in the cart, not 4. All right, so that all works. But we're not done with the demo yet. I keep saying, but wait, there's more. All right, and that's the next we're gonna do. We're gonna dive into this WinForm UI, which I haven't shown you yet. And I've got 2 buttons here. I have message box demo and I have text box demo. So the message box demo, for each, the subtotal, the alert, and the total, we're gonna pop up a message box. For the text box demo, we're gonna put the subtotal here, we're gonna put the total here, and we're going to ignore the alert. And that's kind of important. Now I've got some starter code already in this form. So I've got the shopping cart model. I have the populate cart demo or demo data, which I'm calling. And I also have the message button click, the print out discounts alert click, and the text button click. I'm sorry, this one right here is just a private void. Now I've got some starter code in here for this form. So I have the shopping cart, and I have the method called populate cart with demo data, which has, again, those same 4 demos, just kind of show the same thing. And then I call that method inside of the constructor for the dashboard form. I also have the 2 buttons click event already created, even though they're both blank. So now let's look at wiring these things up. And I'm going to do it that same kind of format, in that the message box button is going to call the and pass in 3 methods that are already here as delegates. And the text box demo is going to have those inline anonymous methods that's going to pass in. So let's first start by creating the 3 methods we're going to need for our delegate to use. So private void, let's say we're going to call it print out discount alert, and that's the message. And we're going to say, all right, that's going to be messagebox.show, and we're just going to put the message in there. That's all we're going to do. Now, right away, this shows you the power of delegates. And again, this is not thread safe, but don't worry, most of the time you won't need thread safety here. But when you do, again, that async video will cover that. Okay, that's just a little aside again. But this kind of highlights the power of delegates. For this alert, I'm doing messagebox.show. Why? Because console write line doesn't really exist well in the WinForm application. It actually kind of works, but only if you're running in debugger. To alert the user, the simplest way is to do a messagebox.show. Well, that's great, but the console application doesn't have a messagebox.show. And this is where delegates are so powerful, because for the console application, you can say, well, here's my console write line. And for the WinForm, you can say, here's messagebox.show. For a ASP.NET MVC site, might be something totally different. All right, so that's the print out discount alert. That's the first one we're going to do. And we're going to have another one for the subtotal. So private void subtotal alert. And this passes in the decimal subtotal. And what it's going to do is just do a messagebox.show. And it's going to do the $, double quotes. And here we'll say the subtotal is subtotal : C2. Looks familiar. And again, it's the same concept. It's just that we're using the messagebox.show instead of console.writeLine, which is a big difference. The last one we got to do is we have to create that discounting method. So we're going to call this private decimal calculate leveled discount. And I call it this because it's different than our other discounting method we use in our console application. We pass in a list of product model. And I've already brought in the using statements for this and wired up the reference. That's why it's already there. So product model called products, and the decimal subtotal. And now we'll do is we'll say, let's calculate this a little differently. Let's do it again, if statement, but we'll say products.count is greater than 3? And if so, we'll return subtotal minus, and let's just say $3. Okay, so we'll reduce $1. And you know what? Let's make this even simpler. We don't have to do a whole lot of calculation here. Let's just return subtotal minus products dot count. All right, so take the count of the products, and it's going to reduce the subtotal by that many dollars. Now, that wouldn't be a wise idea because you know that any ingenious person would be buying 95-cent items because everyone they put in the shopping cart gets them $1 back. And that's obviously not what you're intending here, but this is just for demonstration purposes. So I wanted something simple. So with that being the case, now we can come up here to our message box demo and just call our cart dot, oops, we need to say first our decimal total equals cart dot generate total. And we didn't pass in 3 things. First of all, we need to mention our subtotal, which we do by saying subtotal alert. Then we need to pass in our calculation, which we call that the calculate level discount. And then finally, we need to tell the user, which is print out discounted alert. And with those 3 things done, our semicolon at the end, let's just, again, hide that for a minute. Now we can say message box dot show, and let's say $, the total is, and this is total colon C2. Semicolon at the end, and we're done. Let's run this. And it started my console application because I did not right-click on my WinForm UI and say set as startup project. All right, it also opened the wrong window. I'll work on that in a minute. But for right now, message box demo, if we run this, it says the subtotal is $22.93. We're applying your discount, and the total is $18.93. We just subtracted $4. All right, so that's the power of delegates. We're doing a totally different process in a different UI and displaying it differently with different controls that weren't available in the first UI, and it still all works. Now let's go back to the dashboard real quick. I'm gonna go properties and change the startup position to be, I believe it's center. I just forget that. Center parent? I don't think that's it. Nope, that's not it. It's center screen. I always get it wrong. So select it, properties, center screen. I believe that's it. There we go. So now it works. Okay. So that's the message box demo. Let's do the same thing with a text box demo, only we're going to call those as inline methods, those anonymous methods. All right, so here's our event code here. So now let's wire this up, and we'll do it rather simply. We're not going to go overboard with our complex code, but we'll say decimal total equals cart.generate total. And the first one is our subtotal, which is, we'll say subtotal. And again, equals greater than, and this is going to be subtotal text box dot text equals, and I'll say $ double quotes, and right away do curly braces, subtotal colon C2. So that'll put the subtotal in that text box's text value, all right? And it will format it for money. Next, I'll put the next line, we have our calculate discounted total. So I will say products, comma, and the next one will be subtotal equals greater than, and we'll say subtotal minus products.count. So it's just taking, again, it's the same function as down here. Maybe you should, we'll do this, times 2. All right, so we'll kind of double your bang for your buck here. All right, so that way it's a little different. Just to be clear that it's a different calculation. All right, so that's all we're going to do for that one. We're not going to do anything fancy there. So it's just, again, one line, no semicolon at the end, no return statement, just here's the value, that whole value gets returned. And the last one is our message. And that's kind of our alert. But I don't want to do anything with this. I don't want to alert the user that anything's happening. So I pass in open, close, curly brace. And that essentially is going to run that method, which has nothing inside of it, and it's going to be done. So that's how you can kind of bypass something you don't want to deal with. In this case, I don't want to deal with that message. I just want to pass in an empty function, an empty method, and say, run that. Because I don't really care. All right, so now for the text box demo, I click this, and I get this one. I forgot to fill in this one, so let's go ahead and do that. So down here, I should say that the total text box dot text equals $, double quotes, double quotes, and then curly braces, and we'll say total colon C2, and that's it. Semicolon at the end. So now if we run this in theory, everything should work, and there you go. There's your subtotal and your total by just clicking the button. Message box still works, and it gets a different total than our total over here. All right, so that's kind of the power of delegates. You can use them in different applications and have them do different things, and your base library doesn't have to change at all. So if you have a little bit of logic somewhere that changes often, or that might change, it might be a good place to use a delegate. Now, one of the areas we use delegates a lot is events. Okay, so if we actually look back at this code here, how does that method get called? Well, it's actually wired up as a delegate. All right, so if we go over to our solution, we open up the dashboards and go to dashboard.designer.cs, and we expand this code here. If we scroll down, we'll find here's a message box demo, and here's a text box demo. The click event, we're adding a new event handler, which, if you notice, is a delegate. And so saying, okay, here is a delegate. That's the method name. The method name is textbox_demo button_click, which textbox_demo button_click. So it's just passing this method in and saying, call this whenever the event gets fired. So that's how we're kind of elevating events just a little bit with a little bit different flavor with events. We're elevating delegates with events, but the concept is still the same. We're passing in this method to be called elsewhere. Where elsewhere? Doesn't really matter. Now, right now in this form, it's being called from the same form, but it doesn't have to be. In fact, where it's being called on this form is not actually in this code here. It's not in here anywhere. It's being wired up on line 57 here, but the actual call to this method, or all the methods in the event handler for this click event, they're not being called here. It's actually through inheritance. So if you look at form here, form actually inherits from dashboard. Now, this is not a form event, so it's not actually being called from form, it's actually being called from button, because it's actually a button event. Sorry for a little confusion there. But if it's a form event, it'd be called from the base form class. In this case, the button is actually a class. If we go here and look, if we expand this out, it actually tells you it's system.windows.form.button, which is a class, and this is an instance of that class. Well, that class has some events on it, and one of those events is the click event. And so we're passing our method here, this method right here, right there. We're passing that method into the base class, which is the same for everybody. So Microsoft designed a class that can be used by me, and can be used by you, and can be used by millions of people around the world. And all of us do it differently. All of us use it differently. And that's okay. It's flexible that way. And that's the power of delegates. So what we've seen in this video so far is that delegates are really simple. They're just methods that we're passing in. And there's a couple different ways to declare them. One is to actually explicitly put the contract in a place that everyone can see it. And this contract right here is the delegate. Another way is to declare inline as a func, which returns a value, or an action, which does not. All right, and either way, what we do then is we can call it from somewhere else, either our console application like we do here, or from our WinForm application like we're doing here. Now we can also pass in a full method like we're doing with these methods down here, or we can pass in inline methods like we're doing here and here and here. All right, so either way works. Now the one question that may have popped up that may be kind of rattling around your brain, I just want to make sure that I've been clear on it, is that this method, this one right here, actually returns a value. So where is that return value? And that may be something that kind of tripped you up a little bit. So in this case down here, we declare it explicitly, and it's the calculate leveled discount and returns a decimal. But when we call it, we don't capture that return anywhere. And that's because it doesn't return it to the WinForm UI or the console UI. Instead, if we look at the calculate discounted total, notice that that's where the return is coming in, and we're right in line returning that value. So I could be more explicit and say decimal total equals, and then return total. Okay, that'd be a little more explicit. So that method has a return value, which wherever we call the method, that's what gets the returned value. So just kind of clear that up in case that was a question. Hopefully that cleared up some things about delegates and how they're declared and how they work. Like I said, it's not hard stuff. I know it looks a little intimidating, and if it's still a little intimidating, that's okay. Take your time. But when you get right down to it, you're just passing a method around and letting the person you're passing it to actually call the method instead of you calling it. So that's all you're really doing with delegates. I hope this has been helpful. Don't forget, down in the description, you'll see a link to get the source code at this point, as well as the starter source code. So go to my blog for that. That's in the description down below. And also at the end of this video, I'm going to include some other videos that might be helpful. You might want to check those out as well. All right, thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.